But Paul is not saying anything in Colossians chapter 2 that God did not teach in the Old Testament. Because, brethren, this was always the case. That circumcision in the flesh was a sign of something. It was not sufficient in and of itself. So God comes to his people repeatedly, like in Deuteronomy chapter 10 and verse 16, and he says, circumcise the foreskins of your heart. It's not enough to have circumcision, which is of the flesh.
Okay, so yes, in Deuteronomy chapter 10, Moses tells the people, circumcise, therefore, the foreskins of your hearts. And so Moses recognizes that there are two different levels here. There is the physical sign, and then there's the thing that it typifies or that it symbolizes, that is regeneration. Right, the cutting away of the old man and those kind of things. Now, Pastor Beers is going to assume that because the physical sign was given in the Mosaic covenant, and Moses recognizes that points to something greater, that therefore the covenant in which the physical sign was given is the covenant of grace. Here's one of the problems with that. It's that from that they argue that therefore baptism, which in their view represents the same thing, replaces circumcision within this singular covenant. And we've already shown that in the Colossians 2 passage, they're not actually just plug-in different things. One is talking about regeneration, the other is talking about our passing through the judgment and our justification in Christ, that being the baptism. So they're not equatable in that fashion. But even then, what Pastor Beers is not doing is going through Paul's understanding of how circumcision differs from baptism. Now, he's going to get into Romans 4, and we will go there in just a moment. But circumcision was a type of regeneration. But in Paul's theology, there's something very crucial that we need to note about circumcision. And that is found in Galatians chapter 5 and verse 3, where he says, I testify to every man who accepts circumcision that he is obligated to keep the whole law. Now, in Galatians 5, he's arguing against the Judaizers who taught that in order to have a right standing before God, there were things other than faith in Christ that one had to do for the securing and or maintaining of that righteous standing in the eternal courtroom of God. And so Paul in Galatians is very clearly contrasting the principle of works righteousness, which he quotes as do this and live from Leviticus, and the principle of grace alone through faith alone. And for Paul, the sign of circumcision is representative of the works principle of self-righteousness. That is, do this and live. Why is that the case for Paul? Because Paul recognizes that the covenant in which circumcision was given was a covenant that was a echo of the original Adamic works principle and functioned as a works principle on its own level. Inheritance in the land, maintenance of the land was maintained, was secured by one's obedience to the law. And circumcision bound one to keep the law, to maintain their standing before God in that typological context, the context of their standing before God in the land. Now, Paul obviously uses that as a type of the broader principle of works when we come to the eternal courtroom and works having an impact on one's eternal standing before God as well. But it cannot be rightly said that baptism binds one to keep the whole law in the way that Paul uses that phrase in Galatians chapter 5. That's one of the clearest refutations of the equation between baptism and circumcision. If one simply replaces the other, then baptism binds one to keep the whole law, and not in the context that a traditional Presbyterian would want to say, well, maybe you could say baptism binds one to keep the law in the sense that we have a general obligation to obey God's law, and baptism represents our covenant obligation to obey God's law, because they define that covenant obligation to obey God's law in the context of sanctification, not in the context of affecting one's status and justification, but as an outworking of sanctification. And so, but that's not the contrast that Paul is making when he says that circumcision binds one to keep the whole law. He specifically contrasts that with the principle of grace alone through faith alone. And so if you're going to say that baptism binds one to keep the whole law, then in order to maintain the equation between baptism and circumcision, then you have to accept the context that Paul defined for circumcision as binding to keep the whole law in the context of do this and live, and import that into baptism as well. And now, once you've done that, welcome, you're a federal visionist who brings our works post-baptism into the equation that have an impact on our standing before God in the eternal courtroom. There is a reason, of course, that it is within conservative Presbyterianism, much more than conservative Lutheranism, conservative particular Baptist, conservative Congregationalist circles. It's within traditional conservative Presbyterian circles that errors on justification have arisen far more frequently because there is a logical outworking of their view of the Mosaic covenant and circumcision to the new covenant baptism and Paul's dealings with those things in epistles like Galatians that pushes you in that direction. It's only through inconsistency that you don't walk through the door of bringing works into the equation of our standing before God and justification. But that's what Paul says. Circumcision binds one to keep the whole law in the context of talking about justification and works. So if you want to draw that equation between circumcision and baptism, go all the way. Work it all the way out and bring that same principle to bear. Baptism binds one to keep the whole law in the context that Paul put it in Galatians and arguing against the Judaizers. And you see that same exact idea about circumcision's connection to binding one to a yoke that one is unable to bear, binding one to keep the whole law in Acts chapter 15, where they're deciding on whether the Gentiles should be circumcised. And the text in verse 10 says, "Now therefore, why are you putting God to the test by placing a yoke," talking about circumcision, "on the neck of the disciples that neither our fathers nor we have been able to bear?" You cannot rightly say of baptism that it puts a yoke on the neck of the recipient that they are unable to bear, because it doesn't have the same function as circumcision, because it's not in the same type of covenant. The Mosaic covenant is not an administration of the covenant of grace. You can't take all this language about circumcision and apply it to baptism rightly, because the scriptures make a distinction in the covenants in which they operated. And you might say, well, if circumcision bound one to keep the whole law, if it brought back that reminder of the works principle and therefore bound men with an unbearable yoke that they could not fulfill, then how could it serve as a type of something that would come to pass in the new covenant, in the covenant of grace, where things are unconditional, based upon grace alone, through faith alone? How could it serve as a type of regeneration if it was functioning in that yoke of bondage and works principle way in the Mosaic covenant? And the answer is that it revealed those realities, that there is that need for a perfect righteousness to be carried out on our part. It revealed that in the context in which it functioned in the Mosaic covenant, and therefore caused men to look forward to the time in which the righteousness of the law would be fulfilled in them. Now, it would take place through the work of another, and therefore it did cast people's eyes forward, and as Paul said, became a schoolmaster to keep us in bondage until the coming of Christ. But we don't say, well, because something functioned as a type of the covenant of grace in the context of a works principle, that therefore it can't actually be something that had to do with a works principle at all. We don't apply that logic to Adam, for example. All sides agree that Adam was under a covenant of works where he had to obey the law perfectly in order to obtain eternal righteousness. And yet, Adam is a type of the covenant of grace. Adam is a type of Christ and his role in the covenant of grace. So yes, something in a works covenant can be a type of something in the covenant of grace without turning that works covenant in which the type exists itself into the covenant of grace. We don't say that, well, Adam's covenant must have been the covenant of grace because Adam was a type of Christ in the covenant of grace. The same with circumcision. Circumcision was a yoke. It was an echo of that Adamic principle. it did bind one to keep the whole law. It did remind men that it must be done perfectly, etc. And yet at the same time it functioned as a type of the covenant of grace in which that would actually be fulfilled within us. So just because something functions as a type of something in the covenant of grace doesn't make the covenant in which that thing exists the covenant of grace. We come back to that same point over and over again. So yes, all this stemmed from, Moses says in Deuteronomy chapter 10, to circumcise the foreskin of your hearts. He recognized that that's what circumcision called for, a complete and total obedience to God from the heart. That doesn't negate Leviticus 18:5, do this and live. That doesn't negate Paul's view of circumcision as a yoke of bondage, a binding one, and a reminder of that works principle. It served both simultaneously. It pointed forward to when that would be fulfilled in the new covenant, and also did actually function in that typological works way in the Mosaic covenant.
And then in Deuteronomy chapter 30 and verse 6, he promises to do this to Israel and their children. A wonderful new covenant, we might even say. A new covenant promise of the Lord's sovereign work of salvation. Listen, Deuteronomy 30 verse 6. And the Lord thy God will circumcise thine heart and the heart of thy seed to love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul, that thou mayest live.
Yeah, and Deuteronomy 30 and 31 is a wonderful example to show that the Mosaic covenant is not an administration of the covenant of grace, because it is in Deuteronomy 29 where God lays out what's going to happen when the covenant curses come to bear and Israel is kicked out of the land. And basically he reminds them that the principle upon which this Mosaic covenant is operating is do this and live, or don't do this and you will not live. You will be punished. He then contrasts that in the next chapter. He contrasts the principles upon which the Mosaic covenant is operating with in those days it shall come to pass in the latter time. Now he's speaking of the new covenant, and then he specifically goes on to say that the requirements that the Mosaic covenant typified, the need for righteousness, will not be something that they have to achieve for themselves. It will instead come down from heaven, and you won't have to ask who shall descend into the depths to get it, but it shall be brought up before you. In other words, Moses is looking forward to, as Pastor Beers rightly said, the new covenant promises, but that only has meaning if you recognize that the covenant he's contrasting it with in Deuteronomy 30 and 31, the Mosaic covenant, and in chapter 29 of Deuteronomy, itself operates on a different principle, and that's why you can draw the contrast. The Mosaic covenant reminded them of the law and the works principle. It wasn't an administration of the covenant of grace, and yet Moses looks forward and says, the day is coming when God will do this. And this is exactly what Paul picks up on, as most of you know, in Romans chapter 10, where he is again making a law-gospel contrast, where he says, Moses writes about the righteousness that is based on the law, aka the works principle, do this and live. Moses wrote about that the person who does the commandment shall live by them. In other words, Paul is saying, Moses wrote about the fact that the covenant that he was the mediator of, the Mosaic covenant, was a covenant in which the righteousness of the individuals within it was based upon the law. The righteousness based on the law. Do this and live. But Paul says, in contrast, the righteousness that is based on faith says, don't say in your heart who will ascend into the heaven to bring Christ down, or who will descend into the abyss to bring Christ up. But what does it say? The word is near you in your mouth, in your heart. That is the word of faith that we proclaim. Because if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. So that's what Paul's contrasting. The Mosaic covenant, in which there was a reminder of the works principle, with the gospel that he's proclaiming, justification by grace alone, through faith alone. And you destroy Paul's argument here in Romans 10 and in Galatians. You destroy Paul's argument. You destroy Moses' argument from Deuteronomy if you then say, but the covenant that's being contrasted there with the new covenant is actually also the covenant of grace, the same in substance as the new covenant. It makes a mismatch of the text. It makes no sense. This again is the reason why justificational heresy has arisen in Presbyterian circles, conservative Presbyterian circles, as they seek to reconcile all this together, what is ultimately irreconcilable. So that's circumcision. It operates in that principle. It was a reminder of do this and live. Baptism cannot be rightly said to be a reminder of do this and live. So there is not a parallel, an equation sign between baptism and circumcision.
Circumcision always signified that.
Typified.
Circumcision always confronted the Israelite with the need of a spiritual change. The uncircumcised heart was a hard and rebellious heart. The uncircumcised ear was a stubborn and a deaf ear. And God says, you need to be inwardly changed. How might we?
Correct, which is why he prophesies the giving of a covenant not like the covenant in which the covenant of circumcision, the old covenant in which circumcision operated, which had no power to do these very things. Dead letter of the law. No power there. Not administration of the covenant of grace. Right, a new covenant, the covenant of grace that actually secures what these things typified. That is the biblical teaching.
How might we state it in New Testament terms? Nicodemus, are you a teacher in Israel and you don't know these things? That you must be born again? It's the same thing. Circumcision was a sign of spiritual renewal and cleansing from sin.
Pointed forward to that. But again, none of this addresses the circumcision binds one to keep the whole law in the context of justification. Now we're going to get into Romans 4.
And look at verse 11, and you'll see that circumcision was a sign of justification by faith alone. Justification by faith alone. You know how Paul sets out his argument in the book of Romans. All under sin, no matter if they be Jew or Gentile. Our only hope is salvation by grace in Jesus Christ. God has given him that we might be justified by faith alone in him, not by our works. So having stated that in chapter 3, he raises the issue, well, is this something new? And in chapter 4, he says, no, it's always been like this. David was justified by faith. Abraham was justified by faith. Now look at verse 10. How was it then reckoned when he was in circumcision or in uncircumcision? Not in circumcision, but in uncircumcision. In other words, he's saying Abraham was justified before he was circumcised. He was circumcised when he was 99. Abraham was justified before he was circumcised. Verse 11, and he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of the faith which he had, yet being uncircumcised, that he might be the father of all them that believe, though they be not circumcised, that righteousness might be imputed unto them also. Do you see the significance of that? This is the very heart of the gospel of Christ. Justification by faith alone in Jesus Christ. And Paul says, you see circumcision, that was a sign and seal of it when it was applied to Abraham.
Okay, we would vehemently disagree with that interpretation of Romans chapter 4. Let me read that verse again and then restate his interpretation of it. He, Abraham, received the sign of circumcision as a seal of the righteousness that Abraham he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. So Pastor Beer's interpretation of that is that Abraham was justified by faith, which we would affirm, and then subsequent to, in the context of the Bible, 2 chapters later, in chapter 17, Genesis 17, Abraham receives the sign of circumcision. And Pastor Beers is saying that in Paul's view, that Abraham receiving the sign of circumcision was intended to be a seal of Abraham's own personal faith and own personal experience of justification. It was a sign, in other words, a seal of something internal to Abraham. It performed, in other words, an ordo salutis sealing within Abraham. We would vehemently disagree with that. When it says that Abraham received the sign of circumcision as a seal, again, we interpret the word seal as guarantee, so I'm going to translate it that way. From here forward, he received the sign of circumcision as a guarantee of the righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. Here's I think, a much better interpretation of that verse, that Paul is making an argument about the historia salutis function of circumcision, not the ordo salutis. So when Abraham receives his personal justifying standing before God on the basis of his faith, the Christ has not yet come to secure the things that Abraham is being made a partaker of. And so you have sort of this outstanding justificational experience by Abraham that's left sort of hanging up in the air. It's like he's declared righteous, but we're left wondering what's going to secure this righteousness that he apparently has by faith. And so then the sign of circumcision comes in as what? As a seal or a guarantee that God is going to send the Christ from his line to secure the very things that Abraham experienced in his personal justification in Genesis chapter 15. In other words, circumcision functioned as a guarantee to Abraham that the righteousness, capital R, the person of righteousness, the Christ, whom he had been made a participant of in chapter 15, was going to come historically. So the circumcision answers, how is Abraham experiencing this justifying righteousness? What is it that's going to secure this for him? Circumcision is now a guarantee that the Christ is going to come and accomplish that righteousness that Abraham had before he was even circumcised. So Paul's argument does serve the purpose of showing that individuals experience a right standing before God independent of circumcision. But the way in which that is seen is not because circumcision functioned as a personal testimony of Abraham's own faith, kind of like baptism, we would say baptism does, but instead that circumcision was a seal, a guarantee that the very substance of what Abraham received was going to come historically and be accomplished. It was telling something about the historia salutis, the unfolding of redemptive history, not about Abraham's own subjective experience of justifying faith. So no, circumcision did not function as a seal of justification by faith alone. If you say that, then you have created contradiction in Paul's own theology of the meaning of circumcision. Because if what Pastor Beers is saying is right, that circumcision is a seal of an individual's experience of the promises contained in justification by faith alone, which is what he just said in the sermon, then there's no way that Paul in Galatians 5 can appeal to circumcision as something that binds one to keep the whole law and use that in the context of arguing against the idea of works righteousness. If circumcision binds one to keep the whole law and is an echo of the works principle, it can't serve as a seal of justification by faith alone. That's incoherent and it's contradictory. And so if you take Pastor Beers' interpretation of Romans 4, then you have two different contradictory views of circumcision in the theology of Paul. One in which it is a sign of justification by faith alone, the other in which it binds one to keep the whole law in the context of in justification by works. It makes no sense, and the only way to avoid that dichotomy is to recognize the historia salutis function of the sealing role of circumcision, that it sealed the coming of the Christ in history to then secure the very thing that Abraham experienced through his faith, his justifying standing before God. And in that case, circumcision can still function as something that binds one to keep the Mosaic law for life in the land, but also is a reminder that God has said that he will send the Christ from this people. And all of Paul's theology of circumcision and justification, his argument in Romans and his argument in Galatians, all falls together and makes perfect sense, and there's no contradiction between it. But again, if you interpret Romans 4 as saying that circumcision made a statement about Abraham's justification by faith alone, then you've got a world of problems in Paul's theology of circumcision and how to square the different passages in which he addresses circumcision together.
Circumcision was a seal of God's promise that Abraham was justified by faith.
No, it was a seal of God's promise that the Messiah would come from his line. You have to see that, or you're not going to be able to exegete Galatians and Romans consistently.
Fourthly, circumcision was a sign of spiritual consecration to God. It didn't only seal the promise of the covenant to God's people. It also sealed the obligation of that covenant. So when God addresses Abraham way back in Genesis chapter 17, he begins in this way, verse 1. And when Abram was 90 years old and 9, the Lord appeared to Abram and said unto him, I am Almighty God, walk before me and be thou perfect. So you've got the summary promise of the covenant in verse 7, I will be your God and the God of your children. And you've got the summary obligation of the covenant in verse 1. This is what it requires of you, Abraham. That you walk before me, that you be perfect in the whole of your life. If you're hearing that this morning, you're hearing a call for faithful, wholehearted obedience and covenant faithfulness in the whole of your life. Consecration. Consecration in the sense of dying unto yourself and living unto God. And God says, now, Abraham, we're going to seal and signify it all with this circumcision, the cutting off of the flesh. And in that way, God was saying to Abraham and his seed, you are not your own. I own you. And you must live unto me in everything. Very well.
Okay, so I have a major issue with what was just said there. So he says that circumcision binds one to the obligations of the covenant, and then he quoted Genesis 17, where God comes and says, walk before me and be blameless, in the context of giving Abraham the sign of circumcision. Now, because Pastor Beers believes that this covenant, the Abrahamic covenant, is an administration of the covenant of grace and operates on the principle of grace alone through faith alone, and not upon a works principle, then when he reads statements like walk before me and be blameless, and says things like circumcision binds covenant faithfulness onto its adherents, what Pastor Beers has to mean by that is he has to be saying that the obedience being spoken of there is what we would typically think of as obedience in the context of sanctification. And in other words, an obedience that does not function in terms of our standing before God, but having been justified, we then walk in faithful obedience, right? Gospel obedience, evangelical obedience is basically what he has to be saying. That has to be how he interprets the obedience of Abraham and the command to walk before me and be blameless. That is a call to gospel obedience. Just like as Pastor Beers just did right there, he then turned to his congregation and says the same thing applies to you. You are to walk in gospel obedience. Obedience in the context of sanctification, with justification being presupposed to have already been a settled matter. So then circumcision in this context would be binding one to gospel obedience, non-saving obedience, non-justifying obedience. And in traditional historic Reformed theology, one's obedience in the context of a covenant, the role of one's obedience, I should say, in the context of a covenant, depends upon the nature of that covenant. If it is a covenant of works, like with Adam, or the covenant that Christ fulfills on our behalf, then that obedience, that covenant obedience, functions on the principle of do this and live, do this and receive a reward, right? But if we're talking about a gospel covenant, a covenant based on grace alone through faith alone, then the obedience required in the covenant is, like we said, a non-meritorious obedience. It is one that does not affect our standing before God or get us covenantal rewards. So those are the two types of obedience that you can have in the context of a covenant. And again, Pastor Beers is choosing the latter for the Abrahamic covenant and circumcision binding one to a non-meritorious sanctifying obedience. The problem is, like we said, that's not how the Apostle Paul interprets the role of circumcision and what it bound. Paul says, in the context of arguing against justificational errors by the Judaizers, in Galatians chapter 5 especially, that circumcision binds one to keep the whole law. Pastor Beers just said circumcision bound one to obedience. But the context in which Paul's putting that is in the context of being obligated to earn one's standing before God. Pastor Beers is completely reversing Paul's argument and Paul's view of circumcision and the type of obedience it bound one to. He's saying it bound one to gospel obedience. That's exactly the opposite of the argument that Paul is making in Galatians. You can't make heads or tails of what Paul is saying there and make it make coherent sense if you say that circumcision binds one to keep the whole law in terms of gospel obedience. Because then now there's no contradiction between the Judaizers and grace alone through faith alone. Who's Paul arguing against? Again, this is what the federal vision and the monocovenantalists and guys who have gone erroneous on justification want to argue and basically say there is no distinction between gospel obedience and meritorious covenant of works obedience. It's all the same, and then they end up making our obedience in some way in some way affecting our standing before God, and they sneak works righteousness in through the back door. So I'm sorry, what Pastor Beers has said here about the role of circumcision and binding one to keep the laws of the covenant is not the interpretation that Paul gives, nor is it the interpretation given in Genesis, where Abraham's obedience, which he was bound to in Genesis 17, is later on stated in 22 and 26 to be an obedience not that came in the context of gospel obedience where no reward is received, but is instead the basis upon which the Abrahamic covenant's promises are secured meritoriously. I would just say this is opposite from the biblical presentation. It's literally the exact opposite of the way that Genesis and Paul and Galatians interpret circumcision, the obedience it bound, and how that related to the covenant, and does show that the Abrahamic covenant is not the covenant of grace, and that circumcision was not a sign of the covenant of grace alone through faith alone.
I hope you see that circumcision was not some mere national badge of ethnic and racial identity.
No, it was a lot more than that. But it was not a sign of the covenant of grace.
Tragic it was that Israel turned it into that and then boasted in it as though they had Abraham as their father and all was well. They wrongly emptied it of its meaning, which taught them not to trust in the flesh, but in their utter need of God's grace for their salvation.
It pointed to that. Yes, but in the context of putting on them a yoke of bondage of do this and live to make them look outside to the fulfillment of it.
And I need everything that circumcision symbolized. Otherwise we're not saved. Circumcision didn't give it to them any more than baptism gives it to us today. But we need the things signified. Cleansing from sin, renewal by God's grace, justification by faith alone, whereby we are brought into union and communion with Jesus Christ, which is the whole of our salvation. So it wasn't merely a national badge. But that being established, note this also. This sign, with all of its meaning, was applied to believers and their children. God told Abraham when he was 90...
No. Abraham's offspring and descendants through the line of Isaac and Jacob. Not believers and their children. That's never stated in the Old Testament. The appeal of their right to receive circumcision is always tied into their genealogical connection to Abraham as their covenant head. Each generation did not become a holiness imparting root. It was not believers or professing believers and their children who received this sign. That's just simply not taught or presented explicitly or by good and necessary consequence in the Old Testament.
Circumcise yourself, Abraham. While you're at it, there's Ishmael. He's 13. Circumcise him too. And when Isaac's born, Abraham, circumcise him when he's 8 days old, and so on throughout all of your generations.
Yes, Ishmael is circumcised because at that point Isaac has not been born yet, and the distinction about which direction the promise of the coming of the Messiah will run through has not been made. The distinction of through Isaac your offspring shall be named has not been made, so he receives the sign of circumcision, because at that point, of course, he was a part of the Abrahamic family. It is only when God comes along and then makes his sovereign distinction about which direction that covenant promise will run, that then Ishmael is, and his descendants, I should say, are no longer covenantally connected to Abraham, and therefore no longer receive the ongoing sign of the covenant through their generations.
Now let's stop there and just let that sink in. This sign, with all of its meaning, was applied to believers and their children. Because it's at this point we meet another objection against our practice of infant baptism, don't we? It goes like this. How can you give a signed baptism which is so pregnant with spiritual reality? How can you give it to a baby? It's a sign of the new birth. It's a sign of repenting and believing the gospel. And you're giving it to a child who can't even understand words, who can't repent or believe, who doesn't know anything about the Bible. You don't know if that child has the reality, nor do you know if that child ever will have the reality. And we say, yes, but that's okay, because God did it for thousands of years in the Old Testament.
Again, equating the covenants together and equating the signs as one and the same, because circumcision was a sign of connection to the physical offspring of Abraham. Baptism is a sign of connection to the spiritual offspring of Abraham. Again, it's type, antitype. Spiritual offspring of Abraham, physical offspring of Abraham, a type of the spiritual offspring of Abraham.
The Old Testament church did it at the instigation and command of the Lord, and that was enough. So the same argument against applying such a spiritual sign unto children today would have to extend back into the Old Testament, wouldn't it? And it would have to condemn God for what he commanded then.
Yeah, that's why the objection is not primarily, we wouldn't primarily formulate it as, well, you're applying such a spiritual sign that's too vague and non-descriptive for the objection to be valid or to make sense. Again, the objection is that you are confusing two different covenants. You are misinterpreting types and antitypes, and certainly the distinction that the New Testament draws between the function of circumcision in its covenant and the function of baptism in its covenant. In both Colossians chapter 2 and in passages like Galatians chapter 5.
Our brothers, maybe not literally, but their theology would do this. They would run and get in between Abraham and Isaac, and they would say, Abraham, don't you understand? Isaac, you don't know if he's justified by faith.
Yes, not why he was applying the sign to Isaac. So, no, we would tell Abraham, go circumcise Isaac. The Messiah is coming in from his line.
He's born again, Abraham. Or maybe it would have Abraham saying to the Lord, well, I get that you want me to be circumcised, Lord, because you called me out of Ur. I'm 99 years old. I have owned you as my Lord. But but God, I think you're making a mistake here. Don't you know Isaac's just a baby? God said, do it, and Abraham did it. Maybe you've struggled with this argument before, or maybe you struggle with it still today. If that's the case, I beg you to let it go. It doesn't stand. It doesn't have any scriptural warrant whatsoever. This idea, how can you give a sign so pregnant with spiritual meaning to a baby that you don't know has the reality? God did it for thousands of years. Let that argument go. And
again, that's not really the argument at its core.
While you're letting it go, I ask you to do something else. Consider all these other arguments that you hold so strongly against infant baptism, and ask yourself, if you've got that one so wrong, could it be that you're not seeing something else with respect to the other ones?
Nope, not in this case.
Furthermore here, many who received the sign grew up never to have the reality. Many who received the sign grew up never to have the reality, and God required them to receive the sign. You have it in Genesis chapter 17. Abraham...
But they did have the reality of the thing that the sign was intended to function as on its first level fulfillment. In the context of the typological covenant for life in the land of Canaan, they did have the substance of that. Now that was also a type of spiritual realities in the new covenant, like we keep saying. But it's not the case that those who were circumcised didn't have the substance of the thing that circumcision was intended to function with in their life. No, it did exactly what it was intended to do in marking off the genealogy from which the Messiah would come and for life in the land, etc.
Years old and 9 when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. And Ishmael his son was 13 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. But what comes before that? Abraham saying unto the Lord, "Oh, let Ishmael live before you." And God opening up his decree to Abraham and saying, no. In Isaac, your seed is going to be called. He actually tells Abraham that Isaac will be the line in which this covenant is particularly continued. And yet he says, circumcise Ishmael.
Okay, so there you just had a perfect example of the conflation of the Ordo Salutis with the Historia Salutis, the exact thing that I talked about when we went through Romans chapter 9. And we looked at all those different promises that Paul quotes at the beginning of the chapter from the Old Testament. Things like, this time next year I shall return and Sarah shall have a son. And we said that very often the Paedobaptist will confuse those as having been promises dealing with a person's eternal standing before God, because they see that, well, later on in Romans 9, Paul makes an application to the question of eternal election and damnation. But our argument was no. Paul's quoting texts that in their original context were not making statements about anybody's salvation or anybody's participation or standing in the covenant of grace or in terms of their salvation. They were making statements about through whom the Messiah would come in the outworking of the Abrahamic covenant. They were, in other words, Historia Salutis statements. But that they were a type a type of God's dealings with the members of the covenant of grace, because in the Abrahamic covenant and God's dealings with them, he was choosing, according to his sovereign prerogative, through whom those promises that Christ would come into the world would run. Now, for Pastor Beer, since he appeals to the Ishmael versus Isaac paradigm in the statement, through Isaac your offspring shall be named, as support to say, see, here you have Ishmael, someone who did not receive saving benefits, the substance of the covenant of grace, and yet he received the sign of circumcision, and that God even told him that this was going to be the case by saying, through Isaac your offspring shall be named. The only way that argument has any validity whatsoever or coherence is if the statement, through Isaac your offspring shall be named, was a statement telling Abraham about one boy's standing before God and standing in the covenant of grace in terms of justification, and the other boys, statement about the other boys' damnation. But that's not what the statement was. It's certainly not what the statement was when God said, this time next year I shall return and Sarah shall have a son. And yet that's exactly the kind of statement that Paul quotes in Romans 9. And the reason is because God's dealings with Abraham's offspring after the flesh are a type of God's dealings with Abraham's offspring according to the Spirit, his spiritual offspring. So Pastor Beers has taken the statement, through Isaac your offspring shall be named. He has read into it a statement about Isaac's eternal salvation versus Ishmael's, when in the original context, that's not what it was about at all. So he's confused the Ordo Salutis with the Historia Salutis. He is conflating types and antitypes once again. This is the common theme we're going to keep hitting on.
Just like Jacob and Esau, circumcised them both.
Same confusion there.
Why? Because professing to have the reality was never ever the basis for receiving the sign.
Correct. Professing to have anything was never the basis of anybody's receiving the sign of circumcision, including Abraham. Professing to have justifying faith in Yahweh was never the basis for anybody's receiving of circumcision. That's because circumcision was not a sign of the covenant of grace.
It sealed a covenant that they were to keep and a covenant that they could break. A covenant that had outward aspects and inward realities. And God required his people in the Old Testament to take this sign, full of its enormous spiritual significance, and apply it to the children of believers.
No,
that
the children
is
of Abraham.
Indisputable. It can't be questioned. Thirdly, children were members of the church in the Old Testament. We saw last time how that Israel was not just a special nation, but the Old Testament church of God. The olive tree, there's one root, one trunk. The Gentiles have been brought in to the one church of God. So there's one church in all ages, and that church is the covenant people of God. Now that has implications.
So it doesn't start with Abraham. Abraham's not the root, right?
It means that inclusion in the covenant, its promise and its sign, is the same thing as inclusion in the visible church. You must understand that. Inclusion in the covenant with its promise and sign is inclusion in the visible church of God. Well, what have we seen this morning? Number one, we've seen that children were included in the promise. Number two, we've seen that children received the sign. Therefore, they were in the Old Testament church of God. It follows inescapably.
They were in the ecclesia of Israel, which was a type
clear when you
of the
consider
true
how
church.
circumcision functioned in the Old Testament. Functioned in two main ways. First of all, circumcision was the initiatory rite of the Old Testament church. By that I mean the application of circumcision was a recognition that the person was a member of God's covenant people, his church on the earth. In the Lord's providence, we've actually seen this morning in our consecutive reading in Exodus chapter 12. Here Israel are being led out of Egypt, and the key thing is the Passover. And a mixed multitude comes out with Israel. And God gives them directions concerning keeping the Passover in the generations to come. He says, all of the congregation of Israel shall keep it. However, if there's a stranger among the congregation of Israel, which there may well be, and he wants to keep the Passover of the Lord, let him be circumcised and all his meals with him, and then let him keep the Passover. And let me put that in New Testament terms. If you want to come to the Lord's Supper, you need to be baptized first. It's the same principle. If there was a stranger and he wanted to come to the Passover, but he wasn't willing to be circumcised, guess what? He couldn't go to the Passover because he wouldn't take the initiatory rite of covenant membership. He had no entitlement to it. But if he wanted to keep the Passover and he would own Israel's God as his God, whether he was a Moabite or an Ammonite or an Egyptian or a Hittite, if he submitted to the initiatory rite, the sign of the covenant, then he joined the covenant people of God. He came into the church. Though he would never be a physical descendant of Abraham, though he would never be an ethnic Jew, he would take upon him the sign of the covenant with Abraham together with his children, and he would be received into the church, like Uriah the Hittite, a Gentile who came in to Israel and was one of the mighty men in David's army. Circumcision was the initiatory rite of the Old Testament church. Secondly,
now here's another really great opportunity to distinguish our view of the covenants, covenant of grace and covenant of circumcision, from that of the Presbyterian, that of Pastor Beers. So Pastor Beers is now talking about the issue of proselytization in the covenant of circumcision. So remember, for Pastor Beers, the covenant of circumcision with Abraham is the covenant of grace, which is the same essential covenant as what we are under in the new covenant, only difference being it's now more expansive, in addition to not having the ceremonies and sacrifices and things like that. It's now more expansive, so it's not just limited to Jews, it also includes Gentiles. But the basis of membership in the covenant, the basic structure for covenant membership is consistent from the Old Testament time period to the New Testament time period. And so when the Presbyterian looks at the New Covenant or the administration of the covenant of grace that we are now under after Christ, they would say that there are two basic ways that one becomes a member of this covenant. There is, of course, first being born into the covenant of grace under its new covenant administration by virtue of being born to someone who is a member of that covenant. Right? This is what they call covenant children. But there's a second way of membership into the covenant, and that is if you weren't born into it and you come externally to enter into it by a profession of faith. So this would be someone who hears the gospel, maybe he's an older child who wasn't a part of a covenant family, or an adult of some kind who hears the gospel, repents, and believes. They are also brought into membership. So there's a two different avenues by which someone will enter the covenant of grace in the Presbyterian model, and they would say that same thing was true of the old covenant order, or of the administration of the covenant of grace prior to Christ under the Abrahamic covenant, that there were still those two same basic ways of entering. They would say that most of the members of the covenant of grace in that time period were born into it, right? These would be the physical Israelites. They were born into it, but that there was still this other category of people who were able to enter into the covenant of grace, even in the Old Testament, via a profession of saving faith in Yahweh, and those would be your proselytes, those who were not biological Israelites who came into the, like you just mentioned, Uriah the Hittite, for example, or the people who were with the Israelites coming out of Egypt in the Exodus, who were in that text called strangers among you, non-biological Israelites. They are those who made a profession of saving faith in Yahweh, and upon that basis they received the sign of circumcision. I go through all that. I want to make sure you have that background in your mind, because, like I said, this gives us a great opportunity to contrast our two positions. Because for Pastor Beers, this phenomena of proselytes in the Old Covenant would really be, in his view, the death nail in the coffin of the entire argument that we have been making so far. Remember, what we have been arguing is that the issue in the Abrahamic covenant, the covenant of circumcision, was not believers and their seed. It was the family of Abraham. So the covenant of circumcision marked off the family of Abraham itself, and that for those temporal and typological purposes of life in the land, bringing in the Christ into the world, etc. But Pastor Beers, and I remember somebody sent me, since I'm not on Facebook, somebody sent me a screenshot a good while ago, at least 2 years probably, of a post that Pastor Beers had put on Facebook, where he was basically appealing to this as the ultimate death nail in the Reformed Baptist understanding of the Abrahamic covenant and the covenant of grace. And just to paraphrase what he said there, he basically said, well, if someone believes, like we do, that the covenant of circumcision marked off the members of the Abrahamic covenant, specifically was marking off the family of Abraham, then how do you explain the fact that there were people who were circumcised, received the sign of circumcision, and yet not only were they not biologically connected to Abraham, but they would not even receive any of the temporal and typological blessing promises of the Abrahamic covenant, such as a portion of the land of Canaan. So like Uriah the Hittite or something like that, someone who came into the covenant of circumcision from outside of it, was not given an inheritance of their own in the land of Canaan, right? So he would say, see, that proves that it's not just at stake or at issue here. It's not just the family of Abraham. There's this other class of people whose only basis for membership in the covenant is that they come in by a profession of faith from the outside, and it's not dependent upon their connection to Abraham. So you see the basic argument that he would be making there. And for him, I remember somebody showed me the comment section and stuff, and you could tell he thought that this, some of the comments he was making, this was just the gotcha, can't get around this type, I'm bringing out the big guns type of argument. And so how would we respond to that? Well, it's very simple. We would say that the idea of being, or at least receiving the sign of circumcision and being engrafted into the covenant of circumcision outside of a genealogical connection to Abraham was done not upon the basis of a profession of saving faith in Yahweh. Probably could have stated that more cleanly. Proselytization, in other words, was not first and foremost given to someone or a statement about someone's expression of faith in Yahweh. Now that may seem, I'll deal with some of the objections that have probably come into immediately your mind of examples of people who would point to as proselytes who were clearly godly people who had saving faith. But remember, the basic assertion we have been making is that prior to Christ, you had two separate covenants operating simultaneously. Two separate covenants operating simultaneously. You had the covenant of circumcision, right, which set apart the identity of the family of Abraham, and you had the covenant of grace operating at the same time and really amongst the same people. But they are two separate covenants, and membership in one is not the same thing as membership in the other. So we would say that proselytization, or receiving the sign of circumcision outside of biological connection to Abraham, was first and foremost a statement of that person's identifying with the family of Abraham, and not first and foremost. And when I say first and foremost, I don't mean in terms of most important. I just mean in terms of its immediate reference. The proselyte and circumcision was immediately referencing their identifying with the family of Abraham, not their saving faith or lack their saving faith in Yahweh. In other words, there was a category of inclusion in the covenant of circumcision that was identifying, that would allow someone to identify with the family of Abraham without being biologically connected to it or receiving any inheritance in the land of Canaan, and that was also not granted on the basis of their profession of faith in Yahweh. Let me give you some examples to sort of hopefully make this clear. Right back in Genesis 17, when the first command is given to circumcise, is given to Abraham that he needs to circumcise, you of course know that that command was given to Abraham to do it to himself and to his son Ishmael. But of course, God tells him at the same time to do it to all of the slaves in his house, the slaves that are in his household. Now, those slaves were not biologically connected to Abraham. They did not produce a line of people who would be entitled to a certain portion of allotment within the land of Canaan itself. And their receiving the sign of circumcision was also not done on the basis of their having to express saving faith. So upon what basis were these non-biologically Abrahamic people who did not get any inheritance in the land of Canaan and who did not have to express saving faith, upon what basis then were they given circumcision if it wasn't for any of those things? Well, very simply, it was because they were identified with the family of Abraham. You also see this 430 years later in the very passage that Pastor Beers appealed to in the Exodus, when the children of Israel are coming out from Egypt, and God gives them instructions concerning the Passover. In Exodus chapter 12, it says in verse 44, this is the statute of the Passover, every slave that is bought for money may eat it after you have circumcised him. So think about that. You've got people who are going, who the Israelites are commanded to circumcise them. Okay, so if, as Pastor Beers just said, circumcision is the initiatory rite into the covenant of circumcision, upon what basis are these people receiving the sign of circumcision? It's not because they're biologically descended from Abraham, granted. It's not because they're going to get any inheritance in the land of Canaan, also granted. But it's also not because they made an expression of saving faith in Yahweh. That's not how, they're foreigners, but they're not being brought in on the basis of a profession of faith, and yet they are to be circumcised. Why? Because by being bought with money and being brought into the commonwealth of Israel, they are being identified with the family of Abraham. Are they biologically descended from Abraham? No, they are not. But within the covenant of circumcision, God made provision. Well, I should say the main, as we've been saying, the main entailment of circumcision is identity with the family of Abraham. Now, for most of the people who received the sign of circumcision, that was granted to them on the basis of a biological connection to the family of Abraham, no question. But as we also saw from Genesis 17, and as we just saw again, there is clearly a category that God established in the covenant of circumcision by which someone would be identified with the family of Abraham apart from a biological connection to it, right? Slaves that are brought in, etc. But the point is still, the only reason why anybody, including an outsider, receives the sign of circumcision is because it states something about their connection or identity with the family of Abraham. Again, two different ways of identifying with this family: biological, which is the primary, but also secondarily, in a broader sense, being a part of his quote-unquote household, whether that was in his days or later on in Israelite history as they were brought into the descendants of Abraham. They're still being identified with his house. And in Exodus 12, in verse 48, again it says, if a stranger sojourns with you and he wants to keep the Passover of the Lord, let his males be circumcised, then he may come near and eat it. Now here you have an example of someone who is not bought with money, but they're still an outsider, and they are being brought in, and the text says that they, in some sense, desire to take the Passover. Now, they must be circumcised, but is their reception of circumcision a statement about their expression of saving faith in Yahweh? Is that the basis upon which they are receiving this sign? I would say no. First and foremost, this foreigner who wants to eat the Passover coming into the commonwealth of Israel was a statement of their identifying with the family of Abraham and with all of the typological kingdom phenomenon that God was enacting through the Abrahamic covenant. These people who came out of Egypt with the Israelites, who were not necessarily genealogical Israelites, were allowed to take the Passover and receive circumcision. But what was it that they were identifying with? First and foremost, it was not justifying faith in Yahweh and the atonement of Christ. First and foremost, it was an identification with the temporal, non-eternally salvific historical redemption from Egypt that they themselves were a part of. Now, in most people's minds, when they hear that, they think, yeah, but the Passover typified Christ. So surely it's a statement about their saving faith. And that's where we have to go back to what we've established again and again, that what we have here are two different covenants enacting, one being a type of the other. And the covenant of circumcision having its own objective, temporal, quote-unquote, carnal function independent of the covenant of grace. When I say independent, I don't mean it doesn't have historical connection to the covenant of grace. Here's what I mean. So we go back to the example of the sacrifices. We said that the sacrifices that operated within the extension of the covenant of circumcision that came through the Mosaic covenant, the animal sacrifices, the temple, etc., that those things served a purpose to cleanse even unregenerate people in the context of life in the land. They had their own function, in other words, that was objective, valid, and real, and that accomplished something independent of the saving eternal benefits of Christ. And that's why unregenerate men who are now in hell had their sins forgiven, because they were a part of a covenant that had or that actually accomplished something on its own terms, the covenant of circumcision. And so when we talk about somebody receiving circumcision who is not biologically connected to Abraham, we are saying that the first and foremost thing that they, foremost isn't necessarily the right word, but the immediate thing that they are identifying with is the family of Abraham and the covenant that set the family of Abraham apart, for life in the land of Canaan. Now, there are absolutely examples of where a proselyte who was not a biological Israelite, but came into Israel from the outside, was a person who also did possess saving faith in Yahweh. No question about that. There's good reason to think that the Uriah the Hittite that Pastor Beers just mentioned was one such person. In his, you see some potential evidences of grace in his refusal to enjoy pleasure with his wife outside of while the Israelites were out fighting in battle. You know, he seems to be noble in character. And then also somebody like Ruth, your God will become my God, is sort of a basic summary of what she expressed. And so, did those people have saving faith in Yahweh? Oh, yeah, absolutely, especially somebody like Ruth, and there's no question. But her proselytization, her coming into the covenant of circumcision, was logically distinct from her saving faith in Yahweh himself. And the reason, again, is because there were two separate covenants. So a proselyte who came in could, like the slaves bought with money, right? Those slaves bought with money were not making expressions of saving faith in Yahweh, and yet they were to be circumcised. They weren't biologically descended from Abraham, and they didn't receive circumcision because of their expression of Yahweh, faith in Yahweh. Because the covenant of circumcision was able to operate on its own terms and actually accomplish something inherently. You were able to identify with the family of Abraham and with the temporal kingdom that was being brought in and of itself, without an expression of saving faith in Yahweh. And like Ruth and many of the other proselytes, sometimes they did come into that temporal and typological kingdom through circumcision. Obviously, Ruth wouldn't be circumcised, but same principle. They came into that immediate temporal covenant of circumcision, and they also had saving faith in Yahweh, and that was transacted with them on the basis of the covenant of grace, which was operating at the same time. It's just like any regenerate elect person within Israel. It's just like David. David had saving faith in Yahweh, no question. And the benefits of that saving faith, justification, forgiveness of sins, union with the Messiah, came to him by virtue of the covenant of grace. David was also a member of the covenant of circumcision, which served the purpose of setting apart that people to bring the Messiah into the world. And many of the things in the covenant of circumcision did serve as means by which the message of the covenant of grace was communicated to David and strengthened his faith. When he saw a sacrifice, he was reminded that there must be atonement in the eternal courtroom in order for his sins to be forgiven. But that animal sacrifice was not the same thing in substance as the sacrifice of Christ. It served its own function to cleanse the guilt of the land, independent of anything it did in terms of the covenant of grace and the sacrifice of Christ. And that's why you always must distinguish between the two different covenants that were operative at this time. So, on the issue of proselytization, again, it's very simple. There is undeniably a biblical category within that covenant of being able to identify with the family of Abraham without being biologically descended from him. But the point is that any person who received circumcision, the reason they received it was because it was making a statement about identity with Abraham's family, because that's what the covenant of circumcision was. That's what we've been arguing from the beginning. The covenant of circumcision was identity with Abraham's family. I keep repeating that over and over because if you don't see that, then you're going to have massive confusion on how covenant membership works, what the different covenants are, etc.
The boundary of the Old Testament church. Genesis 17 verse 14, and the circumcised man-child, or the uncircumcised man-child, whose flesh of his foreskin is not circumcised, that soul shall be cut off from his people, he hath broken my covenant. So if there was an Israelite who refused circumcision for his family, he was excommunicated from the covenant people and church of God.
Sure.
Why? Because in refusing the sign, he despised everything that the sign signified. This is the reverse of the Gentile man owning the Lord and coming into the church. This is a physical descendant of Abraham. This is an ethnic Jew who rejects the covenant and is no longer a member of the Old Testament church. Do you see that? See, it's not just a promise to the physical descendants of Abraham.
It is a promise to those who are identified with the family of Abraham. Again, as Genesis 17 very clearly shows, there were people non-biologically connected to Abraham who would not receive any inheritance in the promised land, who still had to be circumcised, and the basis of their circumcision was not an expression of saving faith in Yahweh. Same thing with the slaves bought with money 430 years later in the Israelite lands who had to be circumcised. And slaves weren't circumcised on the basis of their profession of faith in Yahweh. But they also weren't biologically descended from Abraham. So that you have to account for a basis on why these people were circumcised. It's because they were still allowed to be identified with the family of Abraham by being brought in to the nation which was the family of Abraham, the children of Abraham, his offspring.
From Israel to the heathen nations, they're frequently referred to as the uncircumcised.
Oh, and by the way, of course, people being brought into the Abrahamic covenant who are not biologically descended from Abraham, people who are allowed to identify with the family of Abraham and all of the temporal kingdom blessings that were going on at that time, was certainly a type of Gentiles being brought into the covenant of grace in mass in the coming of Christ. There's definitely a typological connection there, no question about that. But again, that doesn't nullify the distinction between the two different covenants that were operating. Covenant of circumcision, setting apart the family of Abraham for the temporal promises that God had given, versus the covenant of grace that was bringing the eternal realities of the covenant of grace to bear upon the elect. Sorry, it's not playing.
1 Samuel 14 verse 6, the uncircumcised Philistine. That means they're outside the covenant people of God. Brethren, the New Testament uses the same language. Paul, writing to the church in Ephesus, says, "You who were called the uncircumcision by those who are the circumcision, those of you who were outside the covenant people of God, and you were called that by those who were inside the covenant people of God, God has brought you in." It's the same idea. It's the same language. Because circumcision marked the boundary of who was in the church and covenant people of God in the Old Testament. Children, I want to set you a challenge today. I want you to go home and read 1 Samuel chapter 17. David and Goliath. And I want you to see how David speaks about Goliath. Okay? Maybe I'll ask you next week, so you better do it. David and Goliath. Who was Goliath? Well, I'll give you a clue. David walks into the camp and says, Who's this? Who's this guy? Coming out in the valley, threatening the armies of the Lord God of Israel. But he doesn't just say, Who's this Philistine? He says, Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Why does he say that?
Goliath was not.
Because the battle there in the valley of Elah is not just a little tribal war between Israel and the Philistines. It's spiritual warfare between the church and those who are outside the church.
No, it was a physical war between Israel and the Philistines over who would control certain aspects of the land. That's what it was. Now, for David, of course, because he's a Christian in that sense, there was spiritual warfare in his trust in God, etc. But by conflating the two covenants together, everything that happens in the covenant of circumcision is by definition an element of the covenant of what's happening in the covenant of grace. And so every physical battle, which is a type of spiritual battles, the physical battles become a spiritual battle in and of themselves. And that's where, again, we just have confusion on the two different covenants. And I would also say that I want you to notice he keeps saying over and over again that the issue in the administration of circumcision was believers and their children, believers and their children. That only works if you turn every Israelite into a quote-unquote believer. Now again, they might want to say, well, it's every professing believer, so that they don't have to say, well, every Israelite was a regenerate believer, and therefore upon that basis their children were supposed to be circumcised. They would say, well, it's those who are externally professing Yahweh and their children. That's who receives the covenant signs. So every Israelite, though, has to become a believer in one sense, either an actual believer or a professing believer, in order to make this statement that the issue was believers and their children in how circumcision was administered. The problem is there were huge swaths of the Israelite nation at various points in history who not only were not regenerate believers, of course, but who were not even professing believers, and in fact professed another God. They professed a completely different religion. They weren't professing believers in any sense for generations, and yet their children were to be circumcised. Why were their children to be circumcised? What did they all have in common? It wasn't saving faith, and it wasn't even a profession of saving faith in Yahweh. That was never the grounds upon which circumcision was administered to anybody inside or outside of the biological line of Abraham. What did they all have in common, though, that entitled every one of them to circumcision? Identity with the family of Abraham. Even if they were professing Baal and engaging in Baal worship, they couldn't get rid of the fact that they were still of the family of Abraham. And it's upon that basis that they were circumcised. It's upon that basis that their children were circumcised. Same thing with the slaves brought in from the outside and every person who proselytized in to the community. They were identifying on the temporal level with the family of Abraham, and that entitled them to membership in the covenant of circumcision and to receive the rite of circumcision. But that is not the same thing as saying that they were in or externally in the covenant of grace. Two different covenants. One typifies the other, and they were carried on in a mixed way, as John Owen very wonderfully expresses it. I think at the end of the next sermon, at the end of this series, I think I'm going to have a time where I just read large portions of John Owen's discussion of the covenants, where he just lays all this out wonderfully, disagrees with the Westminster Confession openly, and says that they got it wrong in their understanding of the relationship of the biblical covenants. And he goes through and shows how these two different covenants were carried on in a mixed way for a very long time, so that it appeared that membership in one was membership in the other. But in light of the New Testament, you can look back and see, because the Scriptures reveal that actually they were two separate covenants, and it is that trial by fire that comes, that was predicted in Malachi chapter 3, that ends up separating these two covenants invisibly to where you can actually distinguish that there was the covenant of circumcision, and all along there was a separate covenant, the covenant of grace, that was typified by the covenant of circumcision, but was not the same thing therewith. And that's why the physical seed, the physical branches, are cut off from Israel as Israel transitions from physical Israel to antitypal, spiritual, and eschatological Israel, made up of true believers, the elect from every tribe, tongue, people, and nation. So no, it was not believers in their seed.
As God is preserving his people unto the coming of Christ. The children of believers had this initiatory rite applied to them in their infancy and were included as members of the church of God. Listen, they were not as the uncircumcised.
Right, because those uncircumcised were not a part of the family of Abraham. It wasn't a status about the spiritual it wasn't a statement about the spiritual status of Israelite children. They weren't they being the uncircumcised weren't in the family of Abraham. The Israelite children were. Now they were federally set apart as quote unquote holy in that temporal sense, but that's not the same thing as making a statement about their spiritual condition. We're almost done, about 2.5 minutes left.
Uncircumcised. They were not as the uncircumcised. They did not have the same status as the Philistine in the Old Covenant.
Right.
Nor was it a blend, as if the parents are in the covenant and the children are kind of close by the covenant. Parents are in the covenant and the children are kind of close by the covenant, moving in and among the church. No.
That's right.
They were
all in the covenant of circumcision, equally, and upon the same grounds. No question.
Of the covenant and church of God.
By the way, if you don't know why I'm continuing to insist on referring to it as the covenant of circumcision, I think it's a very helpful way to refer to it, because that's exactly what Stephen calls it in his speech before he is stoned. He calls this covenant the covenant of circumcision in distinction, to identify it as that temporal covenant that was made with the patriarchs to set apart their genealogy for these temporal redemptive historical purposes. That is the understanding of Stephen, especially when you combine it, like we already talked about, with Paul's understanding of the distinction between circumcision and baptism. One, because they function in two completely separate covenants that were not the same in substance. You start to see that from the New Testament perspective, Pastor Beer's construal, following the Westminster, of the covenant of circumcision being the covenant of grace is not at all how the New Testament interprets these things. There's too much to the contrary in the New Testament that has to just be flattened out and shoved into a box that it just won't fit into. The idea that the clear contrast, as we're going to get into next sermon, between the new covenant and the old covenant as being founded on totally separate promises. They're not even the same promises. And all the Ordo Salutis things being ascribed to the new covenant and not to the old covenant, whether you want to identify the old covenant as purely the Mosaic, Sinaitic, which we'll get into next time, or extending all the way back to Abraham. And either way you cut it, they can't all be administrations of the same covenant. I mean, you literally have to torture language and logic and clear statements in order to package this all into the Westminster's construal of these things. It just doesn't work. Too many questions, too many issues between circumcision binding one to keep the law, like we talked about, baptism not being able to be described in that way in the context of justification by faith alone versus works righteousness. None of it works if you insist on making them all the same covenant. Once you see, as John Owen rightly points out, that there are two separate covenants operating in the Old Testament, there's really more than two because you have the Noahic covenant as well thrown in there. But once you see that the covenant of circumcision and covenant of grace are distinct, everything falls into place. And you do not have all these mished up, jumbled categories trying to bring elements from the covenant of circumcision that only work on the basis of a covenant that's connected to one man's family into the covenant of grace and expand it out to every family. Just none of it works consistently. You just can't use the same principles as we've been demonstrating again and again. So, let's finish this up.
And Church of God. So then, as we conclude, we're dealing with the subjects of baptism. We need to understand the significance of this, because baptism is a debate about the status of the children of believers as a class. We need to know what the whole Bible teaches about this. And so we begin with the Old Testament. And what have we found there this morning? But number one, children were included in the promise of the covenant in the Old Testament. Number two, children received the sign of the covenant in the Old Testament. And number three, children were members of the church in the Old Testament. God willing,
Israel.
We'll look at the New Testament next week. Let's stand for prayer.
Okay, so that brings us to the end. Next time, we are going to finally get to move on to the New Testament. That should be enjoyable. We're going to talk about passages like Acts 2, 1 Corinthians 7, the household baptism passages, Jesus bringing children into his arms, etc. And we will have a lot to say on that subject as well. Thank you for joining us. As always, reach out if you have any questions, and we will get started on the next sermon review here pretty soon.